Great. So my name is Kat Klima. I am the Outreach and Communications Coordinator at the Minnesota Office of Higher Education and co-chair at Minnesota Goes to College. I'm joined here with Beth Barsness, who is also a co-chair of Minnesota Goes to College, and Jeff Olson, who is the Financial Aid Director at Bethel University and a college navigator, formerly known as an outreach presenter at our office, the Minnesota Office of Higher Ed. So today, you are here because you signed up for the 2022-2023 FAFSA training update, and that is what we will provide. And so before we get started with the FAFSA training, I just wanted to remind everyone who Minnesota Goes to College is and a little bit about what we do. So just a few minutes with us, and then we'll dive into Jeff's presentation. So yep, go ahead, next slide, Jeff. So as I said, we've got Beth Barsness here from the Minnesota Department of Ed, and then me, Kat Klima, from the Office of Higher Ed. And so the steering committee of Minnesota Goes to College is composed of K through 12 folks like counselors and administrators, higher education, and nonprofit partners. And we have been under the umbrella term of Minnesota Goes to College for about 3 or 4 years now. We were formerly College School Sunday and College Knowledge Month, which has all been wrapped up into one initiative. Next slide. And like I was saying, so the 3 main things that we do are College Knowledge Month, which is in October, the current month that we are in. If you can believe it, we're over halfway through it. So that's when a lot of high schools and college access programs are working on college search, applications, resume writing, that type of thing. We've got FAFSA and Dream Act events that run pretty much the duration of the school year, and then Decision Day celebrations in May when high schools are celebrating their students' post-secondary decisions. Okay, you can register your site at our website, and we do offer quite a bit of site coordinator support. And so we have a monthly newsletter, we have access to the post-secondary community, resources for families and students, and we do have some resources in Spanish, if that's something that's helpful, which we think it is. We also have some training videos and virtual events throughout the school year and promotional materials. So that is bit.ly, so bit.ly/MN Goes to College. And we have a bi-monthly webinar series. So this is formerly known as the counselor calls. We had them last year. They are bi-monthly, like I said, on either WebEx or Zoom, and they are on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. And they typically cover college and financial aid topics like Minnesota Dream Act, which is our next upcoming one on November 2nd, and grants and initiatives for post-secondary education and the FAFSA completion goal and tool. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Olson. Again, he is the Financial Aid Director at Bethel University. We're so grateful that you are here. You are an expert. I am so excited to hear about this update. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, well, thank you. We're going to jump right into the FAFSA updates for 22-23. And here's the agenda. We'll begin by looking at some of the key online resources related to FAFSA. And then we'll look at some of the more significant changes to FAFSA for the 22-23 school year and beyond. We've got one slide on the new Foster's student grant for 22-23, and that's really preliminary information, but at least it's a teaser to watch for more on this new grant. And then I've got some slides that are excerpts from the normal financial aid night that I would do, and some screenshots of FAFSA, talk a little bit about updated costs of college and such, and then we've got questions at the end. I'm going to go through some of these slides pretty quickly. I believe this presentation be available if they wanted to download and actually go through to some of these links? I believe so.
Yes, the PowerPoint will be available, and we are recording it as well.
Super. So I'm not going to go through all of these links, but these are just some of the options available for you if you wanted to go into more detail. Tips for completing the FAFSA. The third bullet there are the FAFSA preview presentations prepared by the U.S. Department of Education. I think there's 200 some slides in that presentation. They've got all kinds of screenshots on the mobile device as well as the web-based FAFSA on the web. And then I also included a copy of a Dear Colleague letter that came out from the U.S. Department of Education that went to the financial aid offices to really encourage the financial aid officers to make use of professional judgment. In particular, as families have gone through this period of time with the COVID pandemic, and so many families have had huge disruptions to their income. This is an opportunity just to remind the colleges of the opportunity to use professional judgment when it's appropriate due to significant changes in income for a family would be one example. We'll talk more about professional judgment a little bit later, but just wanted to make sure you're aware of those options. The first bullet, I typically encourage families and financial aid and guidance counselors, financial aid administrators to refer to FAFSA.gov. That particular website is still using a redirect, and you can see the new URL there. I don't know when the redirect will go away. If you have any particular links from your websites, you might want to begin using this new site, the studentaid.gov. But otherwise, it seems as though we can continue to tell students to go to FAFSA.gov, and it's redirecting to this new site on the studentaid.gov website. There are not a lot of changes. Every year there's some changes to FAFSA on the web. I don't think any of these jump out as, wow, this is amazing. They're just the small iterative improvements. One of the first changes you'll notice is when you go to FAFSA on the web is a little different look because you need to select a role, whether you're the student or the parent or a paid preparer. There's some menu changes. For example, what used to be called the FAFSA summary is now called a review the FAFSA form, and some other small changes to the screens. As usual, the FAFSA has been updated to reflect any changes in tax forms. There's some adjustments in the household information area where we're challenged to say how many people are in the household, and the logic has been adjusted in the online tool to try to make it easier for families. I know last cycle when I was working with families, they might get to the question about how many people in your household, and it would be a number they didn't expect. And it was challenging to get that adjusted because they had to back up several screens in order to change an answer to an earlier question. So that process has been enhanced. Also some clarification for which parents' information should go on the FAFSA. And the FAFSA tool has added some more detail there, as well as an infographic to try to illustrate, do I include my mom, my dad, which person's information is going to go on the FAFSA. Also made some enhancements to the sign and submit area. For example, when you begin the FAFSA, if you do not choose the paid preparer or the preparer role, then you're not going to see this preparer option in the sign and submit. So to try to reduce some confusion that families were experiencing at that sign and submit area. They've also updated the portion for adding colleges as recipients of FAFSA. So there's a link right on the FAFSA.gov website if you wanted to add a school. As you know, when you submit the FAFSA, you have to include at least one school, but many times students will say after they've submitted their FAFSA, they want to have the data go to another school. And that process has been streamlined. Even now, you don't have to re-sign the FAFSA in that process. It's much easier to add another school as a recipient of the FAFSA. There's a link on this site that takes you right out to the summary of the changes for the application processing system. If you wanted to see more detail on these, but these are the highlights in terms of the changes to the FAFSA on the web. In particular, in reference to the paper FAFSA form or the PDF version, again, not a lot of changes. There's two that I'll call out. One has to do with selective service registration, and the other has to do with the drug eligibility questions. The law has changed, and so beginning with the 22-23 school year, students no longer are required to register for selective service as a condition of receiving federal financial aid. But the question still exists on the FAFSA. The wording has been changed slightly, so they've taken out the phrase to receive federal aid. And so now it's just a statement, most male students must register with selective service system. The drug eligibility question, question 23, has also been reworded slightly because there is no longer an issue of impacting eligibility for federal aid. Moving forward, those questions will drop off of the FAFSA completely, but when the law changed, the FAFSA development process was far enough along that those questions were not able to be removed, so it's changing the way that the narrative is phrased. In terms of the FAFSA simplification, you've heard some of this, and this references in particular changes in the FAFSA that will impact future years. So for the current year, there's some adjustments to the subsidized usage limits, but the area that's of most interest has to do with the 24-25 school year, where there will be a new need analysis formula. So that got pushed back. It was going to be implemented with 23-24, and that was delayed an additional year to the 24-25 school year. That's when, for example, there'll be an adjustment to the FAFSA where students will no longer be able to indicate there's more than one student in the family attending college. Those kinds of changes don't happen until the 24-25 award year or school year. So we have a little more time to work through those details and probably a lot more information coming out to understand the implications that will have on financial aid eligibility. There's a new grant program that was approved by the state legislature. It's new beginning with the 2022-23 school year, and it's for students who have been in foster care in Minnesota. So students who, and the eligibility criteria here are simplified. It's not all of the details, but it gives you a flavor of the direction we're going. We're targeting students who have been in foster care or they currently are in foster care. They need to be Minnesota residents graduating from a Minnesota high school or the equivalent, and they will need to complete a free application for federal student aid or the Minnesota DREAM Act application. But the idea here is to say, let's take the total cost of college, the total cost of attendance, subtract out from the FAFSA what the FAFSA thinks these students can contribute. And in most cases, it's expected that numbers can be very small because of their being in foster care. That difference then should be the amount of gift aid available to help them go to college. My understanding is that this will be available at, I think, all of the public schools. I believe it will be an option for private colleges to opt out of this particular program. Again, some of those details are still being worked out. And I added some news releases here, so if you wanted to go out and read about this, you can read what other people are talking about. But if you have students in your campus who are in foster care, this is a great opportunity for them to be able to go through college with little out-of-pocket expense. Talking about the cost of college, some of the different types of schools that you're familiar with, as we go through the presentation, I'll just be referring to college, and in most cases, I'm lumping all of these 4-year public, 2-year public, 4 2-year nonprofit or for-profit schools all together in one overview. When we're talking to students about the cost of attendance, it gets kind of confusing, at least I think so, because when the financial aid office talks about the cost of college, we're talking about this broader concept of the cost of attendance, which includes the amounts for tuition and fees, room and board, even if students are not living on campus, as well as allowances for books and supplies, transportation, and miscellaneous or personal expenses. And when we look at the average annual cost of attendance in Minnesota, this is information for the 2020-21 school year. And you can see that the average across the different types of colleges in Minnesota for room and board is fairly similar. Not a huge change, even for those campuses where students are living off campus, like the state 2-year example here. The amount for books and supplies, other expenses is a little bit more variable, and lots of variance in the amount that's being charged for tuition and fees. One of the ways that some students reduce their cost if they're considering a public college outside of Minnesota is by paying attention to the tuition reciprocity options for North and South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Manitoba. There's also a Midwest Student Exchange Program that impacts students who are going to school in Illinois or Indiana, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, and Wisconsin. But we're going to focus for right now on the tuition reciprocity. And what can sometimes throw students off, this example is from the University of Wisconsin at Madison for 2021 to the 2022 school year, and this is their fall 2021 tuition rates for undergraduate students. If we look at the bottom row, the students who are full-time taking 12 to 18 credits, students who are Wisconsin residents are paying about $5,300 per semester for tuition. And a Minnesota student might look at the non-resident rate and say, wow, I've got to pay $19,000 per semester for tuition. But what we want to make sure they're looking for is the Minnesota reciprocity rate, which is about $7,500 per semester. And that's very close to the tuition rate or the tuition and fee rate at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. And that's basically the intent of the reciprocity program, to allow a student who would have gone to the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus to go to a comparable school in Wisconsin, which would be University of Wisconsin at Madison. The other thing to encourage students to watch for is not just looking at the rates for tuition, but also looking at the rates for fees. And this can vary widely from one campus to the next. Some schools will have a lot of fees, and some schools may not have very many. In this example, again, the University of Wisconsin at Madison, they do a really nice job of breaking down the different types of fees. And for undergraduate students, the fees for one semester are about $720. But so $720 by two, we're talking about $1,400 for the year for these required fees for a full-time student. That begins to add up. So as students are exploring what's the cost of the different kinds of colleges, I always encourage them, never make the assumption that the cost is going to be exactly the same at any two schools, but compare each of the schools and look for what's the tuition and what are the fees that the student will be expected to pay. Sometimes we get questions about the value of a post-secondary education. I kind of like this cartoon, the student saying, my goal is to major in something that won't become obsolete in 4 years. But in Minnesota, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, or DEED, they've released some information where they've identified that about 2/3 of the jobs offered or available in Minnesota that pay a family-sustaining wage. And they've defined a family-sustaining wage for a family of 3 as being $55,548 for 2 adults and 1 child. This is some economic data. On the left-hand side, we see national data. This is back from about 2015 and showing entry level, the amount that people earn annually at an entry level in different types of careers. And this is challenging the idea that we sometimes talk about is get a bachelor's degree and you'll earn $1 million more over your lifetime, or some really big number. And it's calling out to pay attention to the fact it's not just that you have the bachelor's degree, but it makes a difference what you're going to be studying in. And on the national data on the left-hand side, we can see those who are graduating in the arts and humanities typically earn less than those who are going to health areas or STEM areas. On the right-hand side, this is data specifically from the state of Minnesota, and it's looking at the median earnings for students who graduated from a Minnesota college in 2015, and they were employed, and 3 years later, what is it they're earning? On the low end, $32,000 is the median for those in the East Asian languages, literature, and linguistics. At the high end, it's the nursing, registered nursing administration. They're earning a median salary of around $81,000, $82,000 at the high end. In the middle, we've got programs, students who in college majored in architecture or physical science or chemistry. What is it that they're earning in their jobs? They're right around $43,000 3 years out of college. So the choice is, it's not just going to college, but making sure students have an idea. If they're concerned in particular about how much they're going to borrow and can they repay that, they need to pay close attention to the types of studies they're going to be pursuing. Another way of looking at the value of post-secondary education is by charting the unemployment rate over time. This is information from I believe it's from the Census Bureau, that the citation fell off the bottom of the slide. But what we're looking at is the unemployment rate from 1992 up through 2021. And it's being graphed by the level of education. The bachelor's degree or higher is this grayish color at the bottom, And you can see that over time, those who had a bachelor's degree or higher were unemployed at significantly lower rates than those with less education. And the blue line at the top are those students who did not have at least a high school diploma. The question about what is financial aid is sometimes difficult to answer. I really like this cartoon. The student is walking by and talking to his dad, said, "Yep, I passed math and now I'm passing chemistry and physics." And if I was the dad in this conversation, I'd be kind of excited. Yes, you're doing well with your grades. When actually the student is saying, "I just walked past the doors." And when we talk to financial aid or students talk to financial aid, I often find myself in conversations where it doesn't feel like we're talking about the same type of information. For many families, when they talk about financial aid, they might only be thinking about a grant or a scholarship, and they don't recognize that when we say financial aid is available, we might be referencing loan or work study eligibility as well. They may not understand the extra hoops students have to jump through if they're offered student employment eligibility, that they actually have to go out and look for the job. Sometimes they have to apply for the job, and then they have to show up and work and get a paycheck. But in terms of the best kinds of financial aid, the grants and scholarships, and I was at a school a couple of weeks ago and talking with some students across the table, and the students just didn't even understand what a grant or a scholarship is. And there's such a variety of understanding on the part of our students and where they're coming from. But if students know that the grants and scholarships are the types of gift aid, that free money that doesn't have to be paid back, and it's the best kinds of grants and scholarships, and then if they know where most of that grant and scholarship money is coming from, this is looking in the state of Minnesota in 2018-19, about $1.5 billion in grants and scholarships was available and given to undergraduate students in Minnesota. Just over half of that money came from the colleges or universities, and about 25% was from the federal government, which would be in the form of a federal Pell Grant, most of it, not all, but most of it. About 15% came from the state of Minnesota, and most of that money is in the form of the Minnesota State Grant. And so if students complete their free application for federal student aid and they apply for the grants and scholarships at the college level, they're looking where 95% of the grants and scholarships are. So it's really important for them to understand how and when to submit their FAFSA and to pay attention at each of the colleges they're attending and get those applications turned in. In addition to that, the private scholarships, 5% is still a lot of money. The $75 million. What we notice anecdotally is the students who come to Bethel University who receive a private scholarship, most of that tends to come from the local community. It's coming through the high school and organizations or businesses that are offering scholarships through the high school. It's coming through civic organizations, the Lions Club, the Rotary Club. Dollars for Scholars is coming from places of worship, is coming from employers where the student or the parent is employed. That's where we observe that the bulk of those private scholarships are coming from. But there's also options for students to look for private scholarships online. And this is one of the examples of the types of brochures put out by the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, which I think is just a wonderful piece that lays out lots of examples of where students can look for scholarships, in particular, some of the more targeted scholarships that might be for women or minority students. It's great information in that particular piece. Well, families have the question, how am I going to pay for college? And this particular example here illustrates, this is an example of a family and their plan on how to pay for college. The daughter is saying, "You don't have a college fund for me?" And dad's saying, "Well, of course I do. It's a safely deposited in a government account. And every Saturday I buy this little ticket for a chance to withdraw it." When we're asking the question of how are we going to pay for school or how are we going to pay for college, oftentimes it helps to ask families who are paying for college. And the Sally Mae has done a survey for a number of years, and these are the results showing the sources of the income and where that money is coming from. A little bit is coming from friends and relatives, the dark blue at the bottom of the graph. And then you see about 25% in the 2021 school year came from scholarships and grants. About half of it was from the families, from their income or their savings, and about 20% was from some type of student or parent loan. We'd love for the way the families paid to be all from grants and scholarships, but in most cases, it's some sort of assortment or an adjustment, a compilation of different kinds of resources. All colleges that participate in federal financial aid programs have are required to have on their website a net price calculator. And the net price calculator is saying the total cost of attendance minus the grants and scholarships equals that estimated net price. And what I've done for today is just illustrated and went through net price calculators at a number of different colleges. And you can get to the net price calculator pretty easily just by opening up a browser and putting in the name of the college and the phrase net price calculator. I've done this example using a family of 4 where there's 2 parents and 2 kids. They're Minnesota residents, and their adjusted gross income for the parents is in that $50,000 to $60,000 range. And this is an example from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. They've got a really nice net price calculator. And what they're showing is the breakdown of the estimated costs. And so their cost for 1 year for the 22-23 school year, the estimated cost of attendance is just over $31,000. And for this family, which on paper can contribute about $1,900, maybe $2,000, the estimated net cost is going to be $14,348. That's the $31,000 cost of attendance minus about $17,000 in grants and scholarships, gets down to that estimated net price. They've broken out the different types of grants and scholarships so the family can see that as well. They've also gone on and talked about other options on how to pay that net price. And the U has done a really nice job because for a Minnesota resident doing the net price calculator for the University of Minnesota, that net price calculator does not include merit-based scholarships. And so they're saying one of the ways you might be able to cover some of that expense is by qualifying for a merit scholarship at the U. Also talking about work and student loan options. If we use that same family of 4 with 2 students and 1 in college, adjusted gross income between that $50,000 and $60,000 range. This is the most recent net price calculator results for a number of schools in Minnesota, and I threw Harvard in there as well. Just as examples of schools that have different types of financial aid processes. Harvard, for example, on their website, they say their financial aid process is to meet full need. So this is a very needy student, and at Harvard, the student would qualify for an estimated $75,000 in grants and scholarships, which would more than cover the cost of tuition and covers a big chunk of the room and board as well. Well, in terms of applying for financial aid, many students, if they're not able to do the FAFSA, they may be eligible to do the Minnesota DREAM Act. And this is for students who graduated from Minnesota high school after attending for at least 3 years. They need to, they are not U.S. citizens, they are not eligible non-citizens. And instead of doing the FAFSA, they would do the Minnesota DREAM Act, and the URL for the Minnesota DREAM Act is at the bottom of the page. In my conversations with students, some students still find it confusing whether they should do FAFSA or do the Minnesota DREAM Act. And it's not that they pick which one they want to do, it's really which one should they do. The student who is a citizen will always do the FAFSA. The student who is an eligible non-citizen and looking at the FAFSA instructions should also do FAFSA. The Minnesota DREAM Act is for other students who are not citizens or not eligible non-citizens. And the application for the Minnesota DREAM Act for the 22-23 school year is now available. So students can go to the URL on the left-hand side of this slide, and they can then access the 22-23 Minnesota DREAM Act application. Other types of applications the students might experience or might be asked to complete would be the College Board, the CSS Profile. And not as many schools require this. In Minnesota, there are 4 schools listed as requiring the profile: Carleton, Gustavus, McAllister, and St. Olaf. And schools use the results of the profile to determine how much of their institutional grants and scholarships they'll make available to students. So not everyone should complete the profile, but if students are applying to highly selective schools, that pay attention to whether or not the school is requiring the profile for a shot at their institutional grants and scholarships. But all colleges and universities that participate in federal financial aid programs will require the use of the free application for federal student aid. In completing the FAFSA, there are 4 different options. Students can print out the paper version as a PDF, print that out and fill it out to mail it in. They can call and request a paper version of the FAFSA. They can use their mobile device and download an application on their tablet or their phone and complete the FAFSA that way, or they can sit down at a computer and log in and do the FAFSA online, and that's the example we're going to focus on in the next few minutes. One of the common questions is when to submit the FAFSA, and so I reached out to the financial aid administrators here in Minnesota last year. We had 54 different colleges responding, and the common response was students should fill out their FAFSA in October, or at least during the fall of the senior year if they're planning to go to college right after their senior year of high school. Some of the reasons that colleges responded are listed here, and the gist of it is, you can do it early, so let's get it done early and not delay and not potentially miss out on any money. Some of the campuses, this item number 4, they have a limited amount of need-based institutional gift aid, and that particular school uses the date the FAFSA is submitted as an indicator in when or who will be considered for that need-based money. And what they're saying is, kind of by January, February, eligibility for that need-based fund is run out. So it's not as though eligibility for the Pell Grant or state grant is going to be impacted by the date students submit the FAFSA, but at some campuses, the date the FAFSA is submitted is a factor used to determine eligibility for some institutional resources. I also asked the financial aid administrators, when do they begin sending out financial aid offers to incoming students? So we encourage students to complete the FAFSA in October, but only one of the schools responded for the 2021-22 school year, saying that they begin sending out financial aid offers to incoming new freshmen in October. Most of them are waiting till at least December, and some are waiting until later. Some of the schools that are waiting later, it's because they're frequently they're 2-year schools and they're waiting for decisions at the legislative level to set tuition, so they have an idea of how to talk about the cost with their students. It's not that the schools don't want the students, it's just they don't yet have the information they need in order to present a clear message to the students about what type of financial aid would be available. And so it's really important that as we're working with the students, we remind them, don't be disheartened if it takes a while for the college to respond. They do want to get the information out as quickly as possible, but it will vary from one campus to the next and when they begin sending out financial aid offers. This particular slide is looking at responding to the question of what is the latest that a new freshman enrolling for fall of 21 can submit their FAFSA and still receive the normal amount of institutionally controlled grants and scholarships. And of the 50 schools that responded to this question, almost all of them said it was May or June at the tail end of their senior year of high school. So with the exception of the competitive scholarships, if it's just a normal amount of institutional grants and scholarships, you don't have to have the FAFSA there in October. Students who are waiting and applying later shouldn't give up. They should still fill out the FAFSA, get it turned in, because it looks like they've got a fair shot at normal institutional financial aid in terms of grants and scholarships. When students complete the FAFSA online, one of the first things they'll need to do is complete their Federal Student Aid ID, or FSA ID, and that's just a username and password. The student will need his or her own FSA ID, and if the student is dependent, at least one parent will need an FSA ID. Most of the questions that I get from students or parents who have troubles with the FSA ID, it relates back to the fact that it's a parent who tried to apply for the ID for the student, and they used the wrong email address or phone number. The FSA ID is tied to one specific email. So the student should apply for the student's FSA ID using the student's email. The parent should apply for the parent's FSA ID using the parent's email or phone number. In terms of actually completing the free application for federal student aid, the Social Security number, you have to have that for the student and the parent if they have a Social Security number. Occasionally, it's not common, but sometimes at a FAFSA completion night, you'll have a student showing up that doesn't have the Social Security number for the parent or vice versa. It's not a lot we can do if they don't have the Social Security number. Alien registration number, if the student is not a U.S. citizen, having some tax information, like copies of W-2s or a tax return will also be helpful. There will be questions about the amount in cash, savings, and checking, and some different types of investments, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. One of the common questions that comes back to for students, because for the 22-23 school year, students are being asked how much did they earn in calendar year 2020. The dollar amount, it should be accurate what they're putting on the FAFSA, but in some cases the students really don't know. They may have done some babysitting, or they mowed grass, or they did odd jobs, and they may not have real clear records of how much they earned. Built into the need analysis formula is an allowance for dependent students that says if they have an income protection allowance of $7,040 for the 2022-23 school year. So what that means is any amount that the students are recording of income that's less than that $7,000 amount means that it doesn't matter if they put in $5 or $5,000, it's not going to have any bearing on their eligibility for need-based aid. So for the students who are really struggling, I don't know whether I put in 500 or 1,500 or 1,603. You could just let them rest easy and say, pick the best number, and it's going to be fine. When students go to the FAFSA website, this is what the FAFSA website currently looks like. They'll just click on that button for starting here with the FAFSA, and this is where they'll see the three options, choosing they're the student, or they're the parent, or they're a preparer who is helping the student to fill out his or her FAFSA. When I'm sitting with a student or a parent, I have them do the data entry, and so they're either choosing the student or they're choosing the parent option. Once they enter in and identify the type of person, then they're going to have an option to choose which year, and remind the students it's the year for which they're going to be in college, not the current year. So right now, I believe the default that's opening up is the 2022-23 school year, and at most campuses, that's beginning the fall of 2022. There may be some campuses, if a student is going to begin in the summer, you'd have to determine from that campus, if they're going to school in the summer of 2022, is that the 22-23 FAFSA, or is that the 2021-22 FAFSA? So they'll need to determine which FAFSA they should use if they're starting in the summer. There's also a renewal option that students can use in year 2 or year 3, because as you know, students will be completing the FAFSA annually. So in this case, we're starting a new FAFSA, and the students will click through, and across the top of the FAFSA form, they'll be able to see how far along they are. In this example, the student has already answered the demographic questions like, where do you live? That type of information. And here's where we see the question about the colleges. Which colleges do you want to receive the information? It used to be that students had to have the school's FAFSA number, 002338, that type of a code. But it's very easy for students just to search for the federal school code by selecting the state, putting in the name of the city where the school is located or the name of the school, and click search, and then there'll be a list of schools they can choose from. Students must choose at least one school as the recipient of their FAFSA data. They may choose up to 10. One of the very common questions is whether or not students are dependent, or another way of asking the question is parent information required on the FAFSA? And these are the questions the students will be responding to. If the student says no to all of these questions, then the student is considered a dependent. So for age, for example, for the 22-23 FAFSA, the question is, were you born before January 1 of 1999? Or is the student married as of today, or in a graduate program, or military, or veteran? Does the student is the student a parent, and the student has children for whom the student is providing more than half the support, and will continue to do that through the 22-23 school year? We get into the homeless and unaccompanied youth, legal guardianship. Number 52 down there is the orphan ward of the court, and this is where the foster care comes into play. So students who were in foster care at any point in time from age 13 on, they're considered independent for federal financial aid purposes. Once we know that the student is a dependent student, then it becomes a question of which parent's information goes on the FAFSA. So if the parents are married, then both biological parents' information goes on the FAFSA. If the parents are unmarried, but they're living together, then both of those persons' information goes on the FAFSA. If the student is divorced or separated, then you provide the information about where the student lived most during the past 12 months. So if the student lived most of that time with mom, then mom's information goes on the FAFSA. And if mom has remarried, then it's mom and mom's spouse's information that goes on the FAFSA. If the student lived most of that time with dad and dad is remarried, then it's dad and dad's spouse's information that goes on the FAFSA. Sometimes students get confused on the FAFSA and they provide information about the parent that is no longer part of the family unit. Parents are divorced or separated or sometimes even remarried, and they key in on this, who are my biological parents, and they try to provide information on that, but that's not the guidance that the FAFSA is providing. We talked about if the students are remarried. Sometimes students are living with other individuals, not their biological or adoptive parents. They might be living with grandparents, for example, or an aunt or an uncle. And those grandparents, aunts, and uncles would not be putting their information on the FAFSA. Students might go through all of those dependency questions, and it looks like they have to provide parent information. But in some of the really sad cases, the student, for example, may not know who her dad is, and her mom might be in prison and she's been cared for by her grandmother. That's a student who probably needs to go through some type of an appeal process or a dependency override at the individual campus where she's applying for financial aid. And so she would say, this screen would come up and say, I'm not going to provide information about my parents, and she can continue completing the FAFSA, and then she'll need to follow up with the colleges who are receiving that information to document why is it that she's not providing information about her parents. When it comes to the parent information, this is the kind of information that will be included: names, social security number, date of birth, email address, date of residence. There's new functionality built into the FAFSA to help families identify their household size, and then out of that household size, how many people will be in college. And if I'm in college as a parent and my daughter is in college, on my daughter's FAFSA, I as a parent am not included. Parents are not included as a college student on their dependents FAFSA form. When you get to the income questions, we strongly encourage families to use the IRS data retrieval process. When I started my FAFSA on October 1st, I couldn't get past the data retrieval. I couldn't get into it. I really struggled with that. I tried using this Ask Aiden, which is one of the online bots available on the FAFSA website. That wasn't really helpful for me. So I just paused, and I came back 2 or 3 days later, and I picked up where I left off by using the save key and was able to complete the process without any difficulty. Sometimes families are doing everything they need to, and the website just isn't responding properly. And the messaging isn't always really clear on where that disconnect is. But sometimes it's just a matter of saving as far as they've gone and come back a day or two later and use the process, and they'll be able to complete that. With the IRS data retrieval process, when students authenticate, they'll be asked to check a button to say, yes, I give permission for the IRS to transfer information back to my FAFSA. They'll click that, and the information will go back, and it will be on their FAFSA. Some families may not be able to use the IRS data retrieval, but they can still answer the questions by looking at their tax forms or their W-2s or other income statements, and just answer the questions by referring to those documents. There's 3 asset questions on the FAFSA. It asks about cash savings and checking, net investments in the family farm or family business. Cash savings and checking is saying at this point in time, how much do you have in the bank account or in cash? The net investments always encourage the families to read the instructions when they get there, because investments gets complicated, but families should not include the value of their home. They should not include the value of retirement plans. 529 plans are included as an asset, and it depends on who owns the 529 plan. So if I'm the parent, I own the 529 plan and my child is the beneficiary. So if I have 4 kids, and there's $10,000 in each of those 529 plans, when my first son goes to college, I have to put down $40,000 in net investments of 529 plans because I own those 4 different plans and each of them have $10,000 in them. The family farm or family business, again, pay really close attention to the instructions here, because the instructions say that Currently, you do not report the value of the family farm at all. That's the farm where the family lives on it, works on it. And for the business, you only report the value of the business if you employ at least 100 full-time employees. So in most cases, the small business owner is not reporting the value of the business currently. When the students get to the signature area, again, the student needs to sign and a parent needs to sign either by using the FSA ID or printing out a signature page, signing it, and dropping it in the mail. Keep on clicking and clicking and clicking until you get something that says something like congratulations and the name of the student. When you see the congratulations, then you know that the FAFSA has been submitted. This screen will also tell you what the student's expected family contribution number is. That's not how much they're going to pay for school, but it's the number that the college has used to determine eligibility for financial aid. A lot of students that I talk to get disillusioned at this point because they look at this and they say, well, all I get is a Pell Grant, or I don't even qualify for a Pell Grant. But remember where the grants and scholarships come from. About half of it comes from the colleges and universities, and then a big chunk comes from the state. The FAFSA will not answer the questions about how much grant or scholarship comes from the college, and it will not answer the question about how much grant or scholarship comes from the state of Minnesota. So students will need to wait for the complete financial aid offer from the college or university before they have a full idea of what type of gift aid is going to be available to help them pay for school. Now, again, this idea of special circumstances or professional judgment, this ties into cases where the information on the FAFSA just doesn't make sense. And the students have the opportunity to submit some type of an appeal at the individual campuses where they're sending their information. And common types of appeals might be related to reduced income. Maybe there was a divorce or a death of one of the parents, unusually high medical expenses that are being paid out of pocket. And if students want to go through some type of an appeal process, they do that at the school level. They don't go back in and make adjustments to their FAFSA data. They're making adjustments to through the college or university. So if they're applying to 2 or 3 or 10 different colleges, universities, they're going through this appeal process at each of the different campuses. Well, for more information, there's a number of different resources. The Minnesota Goes to College website has some data there. Studentaid.gov has a lot of information about the federal financial aid process. Here's some other resources in terms of myths about financial aid or other presentations. And then I'm going to turn it over here to Beth or Kat to talk about some of these other resources available on the Minnesota Goes to College site.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll go through these pretty quick too, and we'll send out links, or the link is actually right there. But on our Minnesota Goes to College website, we do have a tab or a link for site support. And there are many different ways that we are helping to support sites in their FAFSA and financial aid awareness for students, FAFSA completion and financial aid awareness. So first of all, I just kind of highlighted the pieces that are financial aid and FAFSA related. So event planning helps site coordinators with anything to plan and host a FAFSA or financial aid night. There's some training videos, which are videos for site coordinators to talk about how other people plan their events, webinars, requesting a college navigator. I'll let Kat talk about that in a minute. And then the FAFSA completion tool. So I just wanted to highlight those. And oh, thank you for advancing. And then here are some of the event planning materials for site coordinators. You click on that and the breadcrumbs are at the top of the site. Thanks, Jeff. And next one. And these are the training videos. So again, these are really short videos that are from other site coordinators or counselors around the state, just talking about how they plan their financial aid events and their FAFSA completion events. So that's under training videos. Next slide. And then we do now have a student support page, which we did not have last year, but we kind of pulled out those things that are specific to students and families, places that they can go directly to find resources for themselves. And again, a counselor could point them to these places as well, but we have some great paying for college videos and financial aid resources. So I highlighted those. Next slide. There's one more. And then updated for this year is there's a 2022-23 FAFSA and DREAM Act worksheet, which helps navigate students and families through some kind of basic questions as to like who fills out the FAFSA versus who fills out the DREAM Act, when can you apply, what's the deadline, and then they can fill out or kind of complete their all the information they would need in order to fill out the FAFSA online. So they can just kind of gather that information before they go ahead and complete the FAFSA for the agreement. Okay, Jeff, could you one more?